Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sirdang Rawls Debate Club Speak Up event for the year 2023. My name is Sumaya and I will be your MC for today. It's a pleasure to have so many great thinkers with us today that appreciate the value of discourse. If you would like to discuss by voice or text your opinions further, a YouTube Live and a Facebook Live channel link is provided in the chat and our social media itself. Remember to be mindful of the people around you and be open to new ideas and thoughts. Harassment or hate speech of any kind will not be tolerated. If you would like to send in questions, scan the QR code available at the bottom right of the screen, or you may access the link available in the Facebook post or YouTube description box. Comment and like our posts. Throughout the event, as student engagement is a priority. Thank you and have fun. Welcome to the Sirdang Rawls Speak Up. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment for our national anthem Negaraku and the UPM anthem Putra Gemilang.
Universiti Putra Malaysia, pembina wawasan gemilang. Universiti Putra Malaysia, pembentuk siswa cemerlang. Semarak namamu di sinar zaman, semerbak namamu di suara sanjungan. Penyumbang bakti ke anak bangsa, pewaris sejati negara tercinta. Damai bersari permai kota, tersemat citramu semoga bertanah.
For our event today, we will have two speakers sharing their knowledge on the topic of liberalism. Our first panelist today is Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, the CEO of the Center for Market Education and a senior fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Dr. Ferlito is also research advisor for Provalindo Nusa Property in Jakarta, Indonesia, a visiting professor at Taylor's University in Subang Jaya, Malaysia, a senior fellow at the Property Rights Alliance in Washington, D.C., USA. He is author of 7 books and more than 40 scientific papers. His latest books are Assessing and Addressing Urban Poverty in Malaysia 2022 and My Malaysia 2021. Carmelo Ferlito earned a Master in Economics in 2003 and a PhD in Economic History in 2007 from the University of Verona in Italy. His work has been published in local and international publications, and his research has presented across various platforms.
Good evening, everybody. Let me just continue from where the MC left off just now. So, Dr. Carmelo Ferlito earned a master's in economics in 2003 and a PhD in economic history 2007 from the University of Verona in Italy. His work has been published in local and international publications, and his research has presented across various platforms. Our next panelist is Mr. Muhammad Fadhil Abdul Rahman. a Senior Research Officer at Merdeka Strategic Development Center, Sdn Bhd. His primary research interests include leadership succession, administrative matters, and overall progress, including the areas of education, gender empowerment, and public service reform. Some of Muhammad's recent work has focused on the impact of COVID 19 to working women in Malaysia in 2020, as well as youth as first time voters in 2022. In the past, he has worked as researcher for YB Nurul Izzah Anwar, three-term member of parliament, and has involved with various debate with topic related to economy, education, and the future state of Malaysia. Our moderator for today is Ms. Kavisha Namsu, who is a UPM student as well as a member of SRDC. Now, I know the topic of liberalism can be intimidating, especially for those who aren't familiar with it. But don't worry, because we've got some awesome guests here to give you a crash course on the principles of liberalism and other political ideologies, as well as delve into how liberalism has impacted the Malaysian government and society. So sit back, relax, and let's dive right into the heart of tonight's event, the forum. A very good evening to our brilliant panelists and everyone. Welcome to SRDC Speak Up on Liberalism. Without further ado, let's dive right into our first question for the evening. First of all, liberalism is a defining feature of modern democracy, commonly illustrated by prevalence of the term liberal democracy as a way to describe countries with free and fair elections, rule of law, and protected civil liberties. However, the objectives of liberal theories and philosophers have differed across various times, cultures, and continents. Different people might have different interpretations on what liberalism actually means. Now, my first question is directed towards Dr. Ferlito. How would you define liberalism, and what are the main principles of liberalism?
Hi, good evening. Thanks for this interesting evening. I think is a very timely discussion. I think that the question that you posed to me is very difficult to answer in a univoc way. And indeed, if we look at what liberalism means in the European continental tradition, and which is usually called as classical liberalism, and what has become instead to be in the contemporary United States of America, I think we have completely different meanings. And in particular, I have in mind the fact that the idea that currently in the United States the word liberal is used to address something that is completely opposite to liberalism, because the so-called liberal usually are creating a new ideology in which they don't allow people with a different opinion to speak up. So in the United States, liberal is used to define something that is actually illiberal. So if I had to define liberalism, I would say that first and foremost is a way of organization of power in which we move to the traditional national state as it was formed in Europe, and in which the principle of power was somehow top down, so rulers receiving powers from the divine authority and then imposing their vision on the population. Move toward instead the idea that people, so toward a more decentralized vision of power, and people owns the power, and they are free to express this by electing their representative, and this manifesting to the division of powers, and an idea that different social groups in society fight in a way or compete with different views for those views to become in different periods the dominant view of society.
Wow, I've never heard a more well phrased and precise uh, definition on liberalism. I would also like to let all the audience know that if you would like to pose any questions to our panelists today, you may scan the QR code in the bottom right corner, and the panelists will answer your questions later on. Now, moving on to our second question. My second question is directed towards Mr. Fadhil. Liberalism has a very long dominant history in shaping our modern world. Unfortunately, the topic of liberalism is barely covered in Malaysian school history textbook. Could you share some historical background on how liberalism rose as one of the significant ideologies in the world?
Thank you, Ms. Moderator. Thank you to Speak Up by SRDC for giving me the opportunity to share some of my insights on liberalism as well as to address some of the questions or lingering issues related to the particular topic. So I think Dr. Carmelo has given a very good and broad introduction about the concept of liberalism in the classical or in the historical context. So from my point of view, the historical background of liberalism has been hotly discussed over the past not just few years but many years. So we can say that the idea of liberalism came up or was developed by a few prominent theorists and economists back in the 1600s and 1700s, particularly uh, Adam Smith and John Locke for that matter. As Dr. Carmelo mentioned just now, the idea of liberalism is to allow the people to expose themselves and to be free in expressing their sentiments. And back in the day, in the 1600s and 1700s, the main topic was to oppose monarchies and also to go against the upper class privilege that was prevalent at the time. And from that point onwards, it was spreading in the European region, in particular the kingdoms or countries such as United Kingdom and France, and later it expanded to other regions such as the United States. For the most part, the entire concept of liberalism came up due to uh, opposition towards the ruling authorities. For instance, in the United Kingdom, the monarchs held a very prominent position in society, and there were a lot of oppression towards the people on the ground. Similarly, when it comes to the French Revolution, which took place in about 1770s or 1780s, the idea of people coming up to voice out their dissatisfaction towards the rulers led to a more reform or more structured way to oppose the rulers at the time. And similarly, it continued during the American wars, particularly right before the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, as the contestation between England and also the kingdoms in United States uh, were affected by the war that took place at the time. And eventually, the idea of liberalism spread to other parts of the world. And we can also say that in the 18th century as well as the 19th century, it spread to some other parts such as the Middle East, and the idea of secularism and nationalism spread in the Turkish Empire. And the ideology continued to spread, particularly after the Second World War, as Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States paid more attention to liberal agenda and also the other parts of liberalism, particularly along economic and social lines. And in the 1960s and 70s, liberalism spread to the other parts of the world, including Asia, as the implications or the repercussions of Vietnam War led to a more individualistic sentiment among the masses, as well as greater push for social justice in line with the liberal ideas presented by the predecessors. And over time, the idea has been developed to also touch on the other parts of the society along economic and social lines, as we can see today. So I am looking forward to this discussion, and hopefully more items can be shared with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you for your input on the historical background of liberalism, Mr. Fadhil. My third question will be directed to Dr. Felito. Let's look into the case of Malaysia. Malaysians, regardless of ethno religious differences, exhibit strong inclination to prefer state control over individual autonomy to protect Malaysia's culture, values, and tradition. To what extent does liberalism play a role in shaping Malaysia's society?
It's a very interesting question, and I understand that when a certain historical culture or historical context feels the threat of an alien ideology or an alien vision coming over, they try to develop a structure to protect the traditional values and the traditional vision. And I understand that indeed we are talking about a concept like liberalism that has its roots in a very different cultural context. So I do believe that this part of the world, Southeast Asia, needs to find a way to decline liberalism in a way that is consistent with the local culture, no? With the local mindset and framework. Uh, Having said that, I think that spreading liberalism properly understood, that means as a framework for an organization of power in which individual freedom and organized freedom among people can find a way of expression, can become also a better tool to eventually protect and defend and preserve what are considered the moral, spiritual, and traditional values of Malaysian society. Because, if we delegate the protection of that vision, of that culture, simply to the state, ultimately those values will become an imposition from the top and will be preserved only out of an heritage, but will not be really experienced by the people as meaningful values for their own lives. Instead, if we allow for that values to compete with other values within a liberal framework, I do believe that the people can reason more about the actual relevance of that mindset and values for their own daily life, and therefore eventually grow in a sense of belonging for that values, not because simply they are traditional or imposed or defended by the state, but because they belong to themselves from within, as as the result of a process of new cultural maturity and maturation and nurturing. So I think that within a liberal framework, if properly understood, those values can strengthen themselves, making people more aware of the real significance that they exercise for society rather than being just a fetish message or let's say something that is there because the government is protecting there. So in a liberal framework, people can take possession of that values and traditions.
Thank you, Dr. Felito. What about you, Mr. Fadhil? To what extent does liberalism play a role in shaping Malaysia's society? What is your opinion on that?
Well, I believe that the liberal values are here to stay, and they have been here for the longest time. When I refer to the liberal values, I'm talking about the idea of individualism, the idea of focusing on social justice, on freedom of expression, and freedom of speech. However, we can see that the norms and also the culture in Malaysia has shifted and changed over time. I believe that some facets of liberal values have been adopted by our society, and this is actually reflected in what has transpired in Malaysia over the past 5 to 6 years, particularly during the 14th and 15th general election. But those are among the political component that we can look at, some of the political elements that we can look at. But we can also see that the liberal values or liberal uh, elements have also resonated along economic and social lines. When I talk about the economic aspect of liberalism, perhaps Dr. Carmelo can also share this a bit later. There are certain benefits that we can see from the liberal ideas of having more free trade and having more openness to market. We can see that after Malaysia's independence back in the 1950s, in 1957, we can sense that Malaysia's growth and development was also attributed to large amount of investments coming from outside countries, particularly the global superpowers such as United States. And also the transfer of technology has allowed our companies and our corporations to thrive, leading to a more developed market structure in the country. Of course, it's not perfect, but at least the liberal ideology or the liberal components was able to drive some parts of Malaysian economic growth. Along social lines, we can see that some liberal values, particularly the ones related to social justice and so on, has allowed our Malaysians, has allowed our society to come together and come up with a Malaysian identity that is somewhat, I would say, ideal for the moment. Of course, there are some flaws here and there, but we can see that the unity and appreciation towards diversity in Malaysia is also a significant part of the social liberalism that we can sense at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Fadhil. That's very interesting and detailed take on the role of liberalism in shaping Malaysia's culture. My next question will be directed to Dr. Felito. How has the concept of liberalism evolved in Malaysia over time, and what factors have influenced this evolution?
Well, this I think we need to look back in retrospect, but I think that uh, in there has been a backlash. So as it was just said by my colleague, I think liberalism had played a very important role um, after the independence in shaping, mostly from the economic standpoint, a country that at a certain extent embraced the primacy of free markets and free trade, and this has benefited a lot Malaysian growth. But then during this has been let's say reshaped during the years of Mahathir, in which a more let's say complex intellectual framework have been developed, in which yes, market were embraced, but with a very strong central direction of from the government, and and then the racial laws were introduced. I'm not saying wrong or right, but surely this was moving away from the traditional values of liberalism. And if I can make an example, if I watch a movie from Piram Lee, the scenario that appears on Malaysia there is much more liberal than the Malaysia that developed at a certain extent after Piram Lee. And I think that liberalism was not able to regain much territory, culturally speaking, after the era of Mahathir. So there has been more of a pragmatic approach, I would say. So we embrace markets as far as we think that Malaysia can benefit from embracing an the economic side of liberalism, but from a cultural perspective, there has been a bit of involution, if I may say. So there has been a step back of liberalism, and in this sense, what I observe on the ground is a bit of a dichotomy between the narrative, maybe we'll speak about this later, the narrative from the government, the attempt from institutions to develop a certain narrative, and instead the perception from people on the ground, which is much more, I would not say explicitly sympathetic for the idea of liberalism, because as also Merdeka Center has demonstrated, there is a very Malaysia is not very sympathetic on that, and there is a very minimal understanding of what liberalism is. But there is, let's say that there is a desire of liberties among the people, in particular among the young generations, but they struggle to understand that this is indeed liberalism, and then the right way to channel their desire of freedom and liberties is precisely to embrace and further develop a liberal framework.
Thank you, Dr. Ferlito, on your brilliant input. With that, I would like to conclude the first session. Thank you all, and I would like to pass over to the MC. Thank you.
All right. Sorry for the technical issues we were having. Thank you for the enlightening session. We will now be taking a short 5-minute break, after which we will continue with our second forum session. All right, welcome back, folks. We hope that you are ready. Please settle down as I invite Miss Kavisha to take over the main stage. If you have any questions, please don't forget that you may send in your questions to our Mentimeter. If you are wondering what that is, the QR code should be on the bottom right of the screen.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope that everyone is ready for the start of our second session. Now, let's jump directly into our second session. My first question will be directed to Mr. Fadhil. Students who went through the public education system often came across rhetoric that links liberalism to being westernized, challenging religion, and unruly lifestyle. Similar things are also often said by public figures like politicians. Do you think this rhetoric will affect public perception towards liberalism?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very interesting one, particularly at this point in time when we are faced with so many challenges along racial and religious lines. So, before I go straight to the question, I would just like to maybe share some of the findings that we have had at Merdeka Center. As Dr. Carmelo mentioned earlier, Merdeka Center has done some research on liberalism since 2016, and we did annual surveys on this particular topic, focusing on public perception towards certain facets or certain aspects of liberalism. So I will just recap some of the key findings that we have over the past 5 to 6 years, as well as perhaps some of the more recent findings that we were able to gather from our recent survey in December 2022. So, few highlights, as Dr. Carmelo mentioned just now. From our survey, we can see that a lot of Malaysians have low understanding about the entire concept of liberalism. They may have heard of it, they may have heard of the term, but they do not understand the principles or the trust included or incorporated within the liberal framework. That's one. And when it comes to the other components of liberalism, political liberalism, social liberalism, as well as economic liberalism, we can sense that in terms of political liberalism, there was a bit of positive reception among Malaysians, particularly on the democratic rights and rule of law, as well as the freedom of speech, as well as the freedom of media. However, Malaysians are still somewhat cautious about abolishing the Sedition Act, as Malaysians, as we know, are a bit more careful and particular when it comes to sensitive matters. When it comes to the economic liberalism, Malaysians are somewhat inclined towards economic protectionism and also big government concept, meaning to say that Malaysians prefer the government to play a bigger role, particularly in managing and handling GLCs, and free trade might be preferred, but only up to a certain level. So basically, Malaysians at this point in time feel that the economy should benefit locals and should circulate within the Malaysian setting rather than allowing free trade to dominate the market. So these are some of the more interesting findings that we were able to gather. And we can sense that from our survey, certain ethnic group are more, I would say, protective towards their racial and religious identity, while some are a bit more open and receptive towards liberal ideas and values. So going back to the question about will certain rhetorics affect public perception towards liberalism? So, in my point of view, there are a few factors that could potentially drive the perception or acceptance towards liberalism. So, the first factor that I would think would be quite important is the aspect of culture and upbringing in the Malaysian setting. This would particularly appeal to Malaysians residing in the rural areas or less developed areas with lesser access to information. as their culture and their upbringing would be basically influenced by the local community and perhaps the religious background of the people living in that particular area, especially family members and community members. When you talk about public education system, I believe that education system plays a role in affecting or influencing the understanding of liberal concepts in our society. And as we rightfully mentioned earlier, the aspect of liberalism was not much covered in our schooling system, in our syllabus, and so on. So there must be a greater emphasis on educating the younger generation, particularly the children and also school-going youngsters about what's the real meaning behind liberalism. Is it just about the sensitive topics such as LGBT or racial rights or religious rights, or does it go beyond that? So I think we need to also emphasize on the key highlights such as freedom of speech, freedom of media, rule of law, democratic rights, and maybe we can even go beyond to talk about gender rights, economic rights, and so on, because we can see that in Malaysia, the idea of liberalism or even the word liberal is closely associated with hot topic issues or red button issues such as same-sex marriage, or perhaps we can say something about LGBT, which are not really which are not really the essential components of liberalism per se. So there must be a newly realized emphasis of framework on this matter. Also, when it comes to what we have right now, at this day and age, we can say that it's not just about the public education system. It's not just about political statements or party-centric statements made by certain individuals, but it's also coming from the media, including mainstream media as well as alternative and social media. So at this point in time, we can see that a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders are taking advantage by educating the public about liberal values, for example. But we can also sense that a lot of people, a lot of groups are taking advantage by promoting half-truth, by promoting fake news and disinformation, which in some sense also is also reflective of some liberal values, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. However, if it's not outlined in the right direction, it will severely affect the uptake and understanding of our younger people as well as our society about liberalism in the long run. So I think these are some of the ideas that we can say or we can observe at this point in time. But I do believe that there is still some room for improvement for us to educate our society about the actual framework or components behind the idea of liberalism.
Thank you, Mr. Fadhil. That is a very well articulated response on the public perception towards liberalism. My next question is for Dr. Felito. How do liberal values such as individual freedom coexist with traditional, cultural, and religious values in Malaysia?
Yeah, I think that they tend to be seen in opposition. Okay, so if something is liberal, it cannot be traditional, and this is probably there are mistakes from the communication in the communication angle from both parties, in the sense that certain liberal groups are becoming increasingly intolerant toward people. Before has been mentioned the gender issue. So the LGBT group, they label themselves as liberal, and people that have a different views are considered inferior in society. So there is a problem also in the communication of the liberal groups that are becoming increasingly unliberal. So the promotion, they want just to create a new ideology rather than promoting the freedom and interaction from different perspectives. So my idea is that we have to separate the two levels. So liberalism is a way of organizing society. Okay, so is a way of division of power and promoting freedom of speech, interaction between competing and conflicting views, and freedom to express that those views. Rather, traditional values, conservatism or other cultural approach belongs to the realm of the competing views. So I would say that liberalism should be the framework. Then traditional values are one of the views competing within that institutional framework. Instead, today, liberalism becomes one of that frameworks. So I think that we should all embrace liberalism as a framework in which everybody has the possibility to freely express and look for outreach for his or her own ideas, rather than considering liberalism as one of those ideas. So it's a framework. Traditional values are some of the values that compete in that framework. Unfortunately, I would say that the dichotomy is wrongly phrased in the current context.
Thank you, Dr. Ferlito. Thank you for your input. My next question is for Mr. Fadhil. Social media has changed the way we communicate, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or a host of other apps. It has all given us an immediate way to connect and share with friends, family, and those who share our interests. How do you think social media and digital platforms play a role in promoting liberal ideas in Malaysia? And how do liberal voices use these tools to influence public discourse and opinion?
Thank you for the question. Again, I think this is a very relevant question, representative of our current situation and climate post GE15, as well as in anticipation of the next general election, which would be largely influenced by liberal ideas or liberal issues. But before I go into the question, again, I would just like to emphasize or address the issue of liberalism among the younger generation. Again, going back to what Dr. Carmelo has mentioned just now, liberalism should be seen as a framework, not an issue by itself. I totally agree with that particular statement, because in Malaysia's context, we can sense that the term liberal itself is associated with several key issues that are seen to be quite sensitive to the locals. So for the younger people, I just like to address some matters I think which be quite important in basically addressing liberalism and also to promote liberalism perhaps in the future. So the first idea is to understand that liberalism itself is not something dangerous. The idea is actually mindful of public perception and also public acceptance. And we have to understand ongoing issues before declaring or proclaiming that some parts or some issues that are being debated is part of the liberal agenda. Also, for the younger people, I would say that we have to go beyond the political or sensitive issues related to liberalism, as highlighted in our conversation today. We have to talk about the economic issues and social issues. We have to address a lot of important needs of the people, which could be addressed by championing liberal ideas or liberal values. For example, we can highlight the issue of economic rights or employee rights. We can talk about gender rights. We can talk about civil or diplomatic or rather democratic rights. So there are a lot of other issues that we can touch before we go into the sensitive areas. And we need to identify the needs and relevance of the issues before we actually champion them and also try to project them at the larger sphere or the higher sphere. Also, when it comes to the issue of younger generation in promoting or championing liberalism, I would say that not everyone has the capacity to champion liberalism as a whole. Some people are meant to be leaders, people are meant to be advocates, some are meant to be followers. So the idea is to educate the younger generation about liberal values, freedom of speech, and also the need to have social justice, and also for us to have a separation of power where needed, and so on. So by understanding these concepts, the liberal agenda will not be seen as something sensitive, but rather something more empowering for the younger generation. Going into the question about social media and digital platforms and how they play a role in promoting liberal ideas in Malaysia. So, of course, at this point in time, particularly after 1990s and 2000, we have had more platforms, more avenues, more channels to promote individual agenda, particularly using social media platforms. At this point in time, we have TikTok, we have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have Facebook, and we have a lot of other channels that can be used to basically promote some of these ideas. But my take on this topic is how do we actually use these tools responsibly to educate the people, to influence discourse, and so on. So we can have our own sets of ideas or issues that we would like to champion, but at the same time, we have to also think about the drawback and also how we can actually manage the challenges posed by social media. Right now, we can see a lot of disinformation, a lot of fake news, a lot of character assassination, as well as a lot of uh, uh, I would say sensitive issues, basically seditious and slanderous statements being made on those platforms. So when it comes to using social media and digital platforms, I would think that they are being utilized to its maximum level at this point in time. We can see these platforms being used by influencers, by politicians, by civil activists, as well as influencers to promote their own advocacy or to promote their own agenda. But at the same time, how do we educate our users? How do we educate our netizens about the best approach and also the best way to evaluate the information being passed or being disseminated through these platforms? That's one thing. And also, how do we manage this information, as well as how do we counter some of the more sensitive issues being debated in the public space? So, of course, we can talk about a lot of liberal ideas. We can talk about maybe gender rights. We can talk about religious identity, or we can talk about multiculturalism through these platforms. But how are we simplifying the concepts for our users to understand what does it mean? And of course, we have to use the liberal values as our guideline. And at the end of the day, it's a continuous process. Social media and digital platforms are here to stay, but there must be a stronger emphasis to not just educate content creators and users, but also to enforce and monitor the content and being put out on these platforms, so that our fellow Malaysians can embrace the idea of liberalism without thinking that it is purely negative, but instead they can appreciate its beauty and benefit to our society.
Thank you, Mr. Fadhil, for expressing many great points with clarity on the effect of social media on liberalism in Malaysia. My next question is directed to Dr. Felito. Phrases like people of color, etc., have been used by Western social movements as core identifying markers to push their cause forward. Social media has spread these movements in Asia should adopt Western terminology and strategies to push the cause forward.
The big fan personally of these hashtags and new terminology for a series of reasons, and therefore I'm not copy pasting things that come from the other side of the world. So I think one of the main I think it would be wrong for Malaysia and for Asia in general just to westernize like the people on the other side of the ocean reasons, because the cultural frameworks, the culture cannot be imposed on other people. Otherwise, it becomes cultural colonialism. So and this part of the world has already experienced colonialism, and we don't want more colonialism. So I think that Asia needs to find a way to fight in favor of liberalism in the respect of the local cultural framework. And I think that expressions like the ones that you mentioned don't play well for liberalism, because they attempt to create a different kind of dictatorship. Okay, so if you don't call that people of color, and I think this is wrong. Narration, I think if we if we look at this expression have become a cultural imposition toward people that have different perspectives or more expressions, are far from being liberal, because they want to impose. So if Asia wants to embrace and push for label, there are contending perspectives. There are the modern people, traditional people that need to burn in hell. And this is not liberalism. So associating those visions with liberalism is harming liberalism.
Thank you, Dr. Ferlito, for your great input. My last question to Mr. Fadhil. What is the future of liberalism in Malaysia?
If you ask me about liberalism per se, I think it is here to stay. Findings that we had, as well as based on the current developments taking place in Malaysia right now, I feel like the certain parts or certain components of liberalism are being embraced by Malaysians without them realizing it. The idea of promoting democratic rights, the idea of upholding rule of law, the idea of promoting civil liberties, the idea of having more expression and having freedom to say whatever they want. These are all facets of liberalism without them realizing it. So I feel like it is here to stay. However, there are certain challenges that we have to manage and certain issues that we have to rightfully address to ensure the concept or the entire framework of liberalism can be fully understood by the people. Again, it goes back to Dr. Carmelo's earlier point about liberalism as a framework. So we have to educate the masses about what is liberalism all about. We know it's not just about LGBT. We know it's not just about the sensitive issues that we have been talking about for many, many years. But there's a bigger benefit or bigger fruit that we can see through liberal ideas and values. So there is a need for us to go to that level and also to simplify the concepts related to liberalism. We have to understand that in Malaysia, I think about 60 or 70% of our population are not really well versed about these academic or intellectual ideas or terms. So we have to come up with a better way to present the concept so that they are able to grasp the elements of liberalism. And we also have to come up with a mechanism to explain the ins and outs, or rather to explain what are actually liberal within the Malaysian context. We can often see some people taking opportunity or taking the advantage to bash certain ideas and just labeling them as liberal, whereas these are not really liberal ideas, but these are ideas mooted based on liberal concepts. So there must be a way to manage that. Also, we have to educate and also expose the younger people, the younger generation about liberalism within Malaysia's context. My personal experience, our personal work here at Merdeka Center, we were able to see that a lot of younger people these days, including some groups of university students who are not really well versed about some democratic concepts and maybe some ideas related to political ideology such as liberalism. So there must be a way for us, for academicians, for think tanks, for the government and also other stakeholders to ensure the younger people truly understand what it's all about, and to also know that liberalism has more advantages, more benefits rather than drawbacks, and what they are experiencing right now through GE15 are also part of the liberal framework.
Thank you, Mr. Fadhil. With that, I would like to wrap up the second session of tonight. And now let's move on to the Q&A session. I'm sure our viewers will be very eager to have their questions answered by our great panelists today. So, our first question tonight for Dr. Filito. Since most of the audience here are students, would you like to share what role do young people play in the promotion and advancement of liberal ideas?
Well, thanks. It's a very relevant question. Obviously, it would be quite obvious, to say that young people are the ones that need to carry out these ideas, and everybody expect me to say that. But I would like to stress that the best way to do so is to study the origin of liberalism, to study it accurately through the history of to the history of philosophy, and to first and foremost in Europe. So studying and getting prepared of what liberalism was in an historical context, I think, is the best way to promote it in an effective way. And I would say that the second point I want to make is, as I mentioned earlier, not just to try to copy a cultural model that come from a foreign land, but to try to adapt and to reinterpret it in an original way at the light of what is the Malaysian culture. So it doesn't exist a model that is simply applicable everywhere in any time. Also, liberalism in Europe 200 years ago was not what it is today. So this is the second point. And the third point is to start to live liberalism in their life. So an idea that is not lived as an experience remains just change reality, are ideas that are lived and experienced in life. And at this regard, I remember when I was still teaching, and I was quite surprised to see that my students were mostly living confined in their racial group. Okay, so when you expect the young generations to be more open to cross interactions, no, but I was quite stricken by the fact that indeed the different ethnic groups of Malaysians were trying to be confined among themselves in college life. This was not a very encouraging sign. So last thought on this is that if you want to be strong in your own cultural identity, you must be open to confronting yourself with different identities, because it is if you are not confident of confronting other cultures, it means that you don't believe in the strength of your own. And I can tell you, I mean, a very quick example of my life. I come from a Catholic country. I am myself a practicing Catholic, and I live in a Muslim country. I didn't give away my identity as a Catholic, but I interact on a daily basis with mostly with Muslims, and we have a chance to exchange our different faith experiences, how our faith life affect our work, the things that we do, the way in which we behave in family, and etc., without attempting to convert each other, but really in an attempt to share what is enriching our life. And everybody remains then in his own identity. When an identity is forged within dialogue and openness, not within enclosure. Within enclosure becomes an ideology, not an identity.
Thank you, Dr. Filito. Our next question for the evening to Mr. Fadhil. Does liberalism have its limits?
Thank you for the question. I think this is again a very interesting question, particularly in our Malaysian setting. When you talk about liberalism as a concept, as a framework, liberalism is based on certain trusts, certain principles that promotes, expression, promotes civil liberties, and basically caters to the needs of the people at that particular point in time. So if you ask me within our Malaysian context, I don't really think liberalism has any limits, but there must be a way to basically propose some ideas, or there must be a way to address certain issues within the liberal context. Basically, when it comes to communications, when it comes to public sensitivities, when it comes to cultural aspect, champions of liberalism must be careful with how they approach certain topics and how they approach certain groups or individuals in Malaysia. For example, we do know that Malaysia is a largely peaceful country. Of course, we promote openness, we promote discussions, we promote debates, and so on. However, there are certain things that would be better off if we don't really touch those issues. I'm talking about, of course, the infamous three R's: race, religion, and royalty. Of course, there is a certain mechanism that can be adopted to channel certain issues in a very balanced and nuanced way. But the problem that we have right now in Malaysia is the fact that we have certain individuals who claim to be champions of liberalism who adopts an aggressive tone, uh, going against or opposing cultural norms in the country. So this is something that we have to be careful about as we go along. The other part that we have to closely monitor and I would say perhaps regulate is our use of social media. Of course, this is something that we don't really pay attention to, I think about 10 to 15 years back. But today, everything is easy for people, particularly for those who like to basically highlight certain issues or certain sensitive issues that are seen to be liberal. For example, maybe someone who will be talking about same-sex marriage, underage marriage, gender identity, or maybe something on religious rights. So these are sensitive issues. And back then, 10 or 15 years back, we are not able to basically highlight these issues at the national level because we don't have the platform or we don't have the channel. But now, through social media, everyone has a voice. So this is where we have to be really careful because we would not want the idea of liberalism to be seen as something negative. But again, it's a constructive concept. So I think these are some of the points that we have to be careful about in the coming years as we have a more vibrant democracy in the country. The other point is, of course, about the Malaysian government. I believe that the Malaysian government has done a very good job in promoting liberal ideas without really resorting to aggressive methods. However, we have to be cautious about public sensitivity and public acceptance. And right now, we can see there are multiple challenges that we are facing, which would potentially lead to a more vibrant or more open space. But we have to be mindful of our society and also the sensitivities of different groups in Malaysia.
Thank you for your brilliant input on the limits of liberalism, Mr. Fadhil. My next question to Dr. Carmelo. Liberalism is having negative impacts on the new generation, or is it positive impacts?
Well, I hardly see how liberalism can have a negative impact. If properly understood, definitively liberalism can have a positive impact on new generations. And again, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that a more liberal institutional framework can be an occasion also for those people who consider themselves more conservative within the sphere of their values and belief, because is would be a way for them to strengthen that belief. Because in the long run, if you look at traditional Christian countries, in example, in which religion has been experienced as an imposition for many decades, ultimately gave up to their religious belief, because when when traditional values are imposed over society rather than experienced within the society, ultimately they disappear, because when something is not experienced, then it's not anymore relevant. So liberalism is an occasion also to test the level of experience of traditional beliefs within a society. So I think is a way for everybody to create a sphere for different contending perspectives to arise, to compete, and to be experienced at a more intimate and radical level by the people. So definitely will have a positive impact if properly understood, not if seen simply as the application of a certain American ideology within the Malaysian framework.
Thank you, Dr. Ferlito. My next question to Mr. Fadhil. What are your thoughts about people who use the term liberalism loosely to their advantage, specifically to excuse their behavior?
Thank you for the question. I think this is precisely what's happening to our country, perhaps in other parts of the world as well, particularly in Europe and United States, where a lot of issues are being associated with the liberal movement. So I believe that these people are, not to say right, but they are, of course, able to label groups or issues using this particular term. However, there must be an initiative to basically counter this movement. Basically, there must be a agency or an institution or an enforcement body that can help to address or help to respond to define what is actually liberalism within the context of Malaysia. At this point in time, this is not being done in a very aggressive manner. At times, there will be some statements made by government agencies or by politicians or by some civil servants on what's liberal or what's not, particularly on issues related to religion. But within the long run or along the long run, public or basically the audience still believe that certain issues are still associated with the liberal agenda. For example, LGBT. There's a deeper discussion on what LGBT really means and how it's related to liberalism or liberal concepts. But the discussion on this particular topic is somewhat seasonal. So this is something that we have to address. Also, when it comes to the people or the individuals who actually use this term liberalism, I would echo what Dr. Carmelo mentioned just now. They must be educated on what liberalism actually means, and they have to go back to the original concepts, and they have to know what or rather the history of liberalism before resorting to utilizing these terms for their actual benefit. So I think this is unfair to real or I would say original or those who actually sincerely champion liberalism in the Malaysian setting. But then again, we have to make sure this issue does not continue or does not basically affect other people on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Muhammad Fadhil. Next question by the viewers for Dr. Ferlito. Do you think that liberals in countries like Malaysia should associate themselves with sensitive groups like LGBT?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the definition of liberalism should be beyond, at a higher level than LGBT yes, LGBT no, or same-sex marriage yes, sex marriage no. So liberalism should be a framework, okay, a way in which society is organized, and in this way, different people with different views have the liberty to express the view, both the view in favor of LGBT groups and both views that are somehow not sympathetic with the LGBT views. In the liberal framework, all these groups should have and this is not the case in the West any longer, but all these groups should have the same dignity to express their views. So I think it would be wrong for a liberal advocate to associate simply with LGBT, because the liberalism as a framework is something on a different level, LGBT should be one eventually of the vision competing within a liberal framework. So I come back to the contraposition that I did before. So advocating for liberties means to advocate for liberalism means to advocate for everybody to have the freedom of expression, those that believe in a certain gender orientation and those that believe in a different one. This should be the task of liberal advocates, to allow all these visions to find hospitality in the public discourse. Then ultimately, in democracy, somehow the vision of the majority takes takes victory. But in a liberal democracy, all the views should have dignity of expressions. But again, I think promoting liberalism and embracing LGBT discourse should be two different things.
Thank you, Dr. Ferlito. The next question by the viewers for Mr. Fadhil. How do you differentiate between liberalism and blatant disregard of morality?
Thank you for this question. I think this is a conceptual question, but again, this is very much relevant with the situation that we have in Malaysia. So again, liberalism is a concept, it's an ideology, or it's a bigger framework that is associated with certain principles, as I mentioned before. Whereas blatant disregard of morality, this is an ethical issue. So I think it's two totally different topics. But then again, some people with disregard towards morality, or maybe those who have engaged in adverse behavior, they displayed some facets of liberalism as well. As I mentioned just now, there are certain components of liberalism which could be associated with blatant disregard of morality. But going back to the history of liberalism, going back to the philosophy and the thinking behind liberalism per se, liberalism is very much drawn or very much developed along the lines of morality, not disregard of morality. It is to champion public issues, to address public rights, and also to ensure the community or society enjoy the benefits of living in that particular region. Whereas when it comes to disregard of morality, I believe that this is a disciplinary or ethical or basically a moral issue. So I feel like these two aspects should not be looked at within the same sphere, but there are similarities and differences.
Thank you, Mr. Fadhil. The last question for tonight's Q&A session is for Dr. Ferlito. Is liberalism better than conservatism?
Okay, just let me add a quick note on what was just said to complete what was just said. Let's not forget that the first famous book of one of the fathers of liberalism, Adam Smith, was not The Wealth of Nations, 1776, but The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759. And Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, was almost a priest. So really, the idea that liberals means morally liberalism doesn't mean to be libertines. Okay. So to make it simple, on liberalism and conservatism, I think that the two things should not be seen in opposition. I, in example, define myself a liberal conservative. So in myself, I consider myself both a liberal and a conservative, because again, embracing liberalism means embracing a framework that promotes liberty. Conservatism is one of the competing ideologies or the competing visions that compete within a liberal framework. So you can be both liberal and conservative. It depends what you want to conserve. And in a liberal society, a conservative has the possibility to fight in order to conserve traditional views. In the moment in which you are, in example, look where conservative didn't have an easy life. One example is in communist countries. Looks at Soviet Russia. In Soviet Russia, the conservative values, the traditional values that was the Orthodox Church, the emperor, and etc., were wiped out, and they didn't come back. The Orthodox Church is coming back just now after more than a century from the Soviet Revolution in terms of social role. So conservatism find a space within the framework of liberalism. So we should not look at them in opposition, but as eventually as complementary.
Thank you, Dr. Ferlito. Since we have time, this is our last question for Mr. Fadhil. And the last question will be, considering that currently Malaysia is led by older and more conservative leaders, how should the younger generation promote liberalism to these leaders without harming the country's peace?
This is a very, I would say, tough question for me to respond because at Merdeka Center, we work with some of the younger leaders as well as some of the senior leaders in politics, as well as in political parties. So I believe that, of course, the younger generation who are able to basically explain and digest the concept of liberalism can try their best to basically channel their inputs to some of these leaders. But then again, it must be done in a very subtle way, and it must be done without jeopardizing of course, the country's peace as well as the political strategy of all these leaders. Because right now we are living in a very fluid society, particularly post GE15 or post Sheraton move for that matter, since we have a volatile situation in which a lot of political parties are striving for survival and striving for power. So for them to actually embrace the idea of liberalism, it would depend on how far the ideas within the framework of liberalism can help them to gain votes and support among Malaysians. So this is one thing to consider. Then again, when you talk about the younger generation promoting liberalism, I think it should not just be done to the political leaders, but it should be done within the peers and also to other segments or other groups within the society as well. Because we do know that political leaders serve their own political agenda. However, who elects these political leaders is the people. So there's a need to also educate the other segments about the idea of liberalism and so on. But to me, the more important thing is not liberalism actually. Liberalism is a framework, but what we need to do is actually to get people to understand the concepts or the values within liberalism, the liberal framework, so that people be able to express their ideas freely. They are able to engage directly with some stakeholders, particularly the national leaders. They are able to exercise their democratic rights. They are able to see the country or the judiciary uphold the rule of law in the country. And at the same time, perhaps the freedom of speech can be regulated to ensure the voices of Malaysians are heard. So these are some of the values or some of the ideas that I think will be quite essential for us at this point in time. We can promote liberalism or we can promote some ideas or some topics associated with liberalism. For example, a lot of young people are talking about having more freedom of speech and so on. But freedom of speech is meaningless without having the proper context and without having the proper idea to be spread or to be disseminated to others for the national well-being. So basically, my point is before going to the idea of promoting liberalism as a whole, we should embrace the values and also the principles of liberalism and using that to actually champion the causes that matter. At this point in time, I can say that this is a very good question because the younger generation will be tremendously affected in the next 5 or 10 years because of the political fragmentation, the economic setback, including employment issues, income, inflation, cost of living, and so on, and also some other social issues, including education, public infrastructure, healthcare, and so on. So who will be the ones bearing the responsibility to actually manage these problems moving forward? Of course, it's the younger people. So rather than talking about liberalism, rather than talking about issues such as LGBT or whatever, we should think about how we can use the ideas or the components of liberalism, such as freedom of speech, to actually get the people, especially the younger generation, to actually stand up for your own rights and to stand up for what you think it's good for the segment as well as for the society. I think by doing that, Malaysia can actually thrive, and eventually liberalism can be realized and appreciated by more people within the country.
Thank you, Mr. Fadhil. Now the Q&A session is over. Last but not least, are there any concluding remarks, perhaps advice to the students that you would like to give on liberalism? Anything that they may want to know?
Maybe I can just start off there. Maybe Dr. Carmelo can share his thoughts on this matter. But I would like to take this opportunity to maybe congratulate all the attendees today who have spoken up and have taken the time to attend this talk. And perhaps all of you can learn bits and pieces about liberalism as well as think about what you can do in the future. So my point is not to actually touch on liberalism per se, but rather to touch on what the young people can do moving forward. Of course, we know that right now the younger people, particularly those above the age of 18, are given the opportunity to vote and to take part in the democratic process. And of course, that's a part of the liberal framework that we have talked about. But the idea is for the younger people to step up and not just wait for the seniors, for the older generation to speak out on behalf of the youth in Malaysia. Take the opportunity to learn, as what Dr. Carmelo mentioned just now, to read, to study history, and also to understand the concepts before we educate other people within our group and within our society. And the other thing is to perhaps think about the best ways to network, to engage with different groups of stakeholders, and also maybe to think about the issues that you think you will face in the next few years, and take this opportunity that you have in university to maybe plan for the future. As I mentioned just now, there are many issues that the young people will be facing in the next 5 to 10 years, and I think this is the best time to start thinking about not just the liberal topics, but also how we can actually benefit from the components or elements of liberalism to champion the bigger issues that we may have to face in the next few years. Thank you.
Some concluding thought here from my side. First of all, I can see the number of participants here, the number of viewers, and this is very encouraging. The fact that so many students over a Friday night came here to listen to us rather than going to cinema means that either there is a big hope for Malaysia, or really the cinema schedule is terribly depressing. But then to come back to my earlier point, freedom of expression is important, but it is more relevant when you have something to say. One of the risks that we see with social media is, in fact, that we have a lot of information but very limited knowledge. So the more information we have, the less knowledge we have. It means we have a flow of notions that don't become a cultural framework. Having said that, I'm not in favor of regulating social media, because when you regulate social media, when you regulate freedom of expression, you always have the preferences of the regulator. So it's very dangerous when you allow the government to regulate freedom of expression. So still within very a high degree of freedom is always better than a lower degree of freedom. And let's not forget that the governments usually are the biggest spreaders of fake news. So they should not regulate what other people say, because they should first regulate themselves. Having said that, is important for the cultural maturity of the country, that the young generation step up from this idea of simply sharing notions or free flow of thoughts without content in the social media space, but as Fadhil has also mentioned, try to study and to give contents, because if you want to be the future ruling class eventually, not only in politics but also in entrepreneurship and so in the business world and etc., you must have content and visions to share. Too often we see politicians that say things only because they have occasion to say something, and is less and less often they say something meaningful. So let's win the battle by saying things that not necessarily everybody agrees, but they have a content. I mean, I'm definitely not a Marxist, but I'm more pleased by read a well argumented speech or article by a Marxist that to listen to empty statements from people that have nothing to say. Because with very well argumented Marxist article, I can start a conversation with what in Italy we call the empty conversation. We call it fried air. With fried air, you can't open a conversation. So air goreng.
Thank you, Dr. Felito, for that very interesting input. With that, I would like to conclude the second session. I would like to thank both our amazing panelists to take the time off and be here today. And thank you to everyone for watching. Now I would like to hand over to the MC. Thank you.
Many thanks to our panelists, Dr. Carmelo Ferlito and Mr. Mohammad Fadhil Abdurrahman, for sharing their expertise with us today. Thank you to Ms. Kavisha for being our moderator as well. A big thanks as well to Bahagian Hal Ewal Pelagier for hosting this event. Without them, this event would not have been possible. Lastly, thank you to our viewers for taking part in SRDC's Speak Up event. We hope you all had an insightful evening. Of course, before everyone leaves this stream, do stay for the merit collection. All students should take a screenshot with identification proof by typing your name and matric number in the chat. Please ensure that a clock on your computer or phone with an accurate time is visible in the screenshot. A link will now be provided in the Facebook and YouTube description box. If you cannot access that, you may access it via our link tree on our Instagram page @SRDC Speak Up. You are given approximately 3 minutes from now. If you are facing any issues with the merit collection or event, direct message us on our Instagram @ SRDC Speak Up. We will see you again. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.